I'm John.
How are you?
I'm good. Yeah, Adam told me you guys. Sure. I think Jeff Sullivan may have to do musical chairs or something.
No problem.
How are you? We have very good to see you. Nice to chat with you. We'll talk more.
Environment and Public Works Committee. We have a quirky rule in the Senate, in our committees. If you want to vote no by proxy, that counts. If you want to vote yes by proxy, that doesn't count. So I had to be there in person, and we can now get started. Maria, you ready? Yes. All right, thank you so much. And this hearing will come to order. Today, the committee convenes to discuss the issue of compensating student athletes for the use of their name, image, and likeness, NIL. I welcome our distinguished panel of witnesses and thank them for appearing. Today, we will hear from Mr. Keith Carter, Vice Chancellor for Intercollegiate Athletics for the University of Mississippi, my alma mater, where I lettered in 0 sports. Mr. Michael Drake, Chair of the National Collegiate Athletic Association Board of Governors and President Emeritus of The Ohio State University. Ms. Dion Kohler, Professor of Law and Director of the Center for Sport and the Law at the University of Baltimore School of Law. Mr. Greg Sankey, Commissioner of the Southeastern Conference, and Mr. Eric Winston, Chief Partnerships Officer for One Team Partners, former President of the NFL Players Association, and former NFL player and college athlete. College sports are a rich part of the fabric of America's families, communities, and states. College sports have long been deeply rooted in our culture. This is true in my home state of Mississippi, where there are over 30 institutions of higher learning that offer college athletic programs. Like a lot of places across the United States, college sports is never far from the minds or memories of Mississippians. Reliving and recounting the results of past contests is a common occurrence. For example, Ole Miss fans still talk about Sinquez Golson's game-winning interception in the end zone to help Ole Miss knock off top-ranked Alabama in 2014. I was there. I remember where I was sitting in Vaught-Hemingway Stadium at the time. And it's still thrilling to recall Morgan Williams' overtime jumper to help the Mississippi State Lady Bulldogs end UConn's 111-game winning streak in 2017. We just needed one more win. College sports contribute so much more than triumphant or heartbreaking memories. Sports help ingrain in our student athletes the values of fair play, sportsmanship, and teamwork. Sports have helped lead societal change, and they continue to help unite the country. College sports also offer valuable academic opportunities for students who might otherwise have none. With these things in mind, I approach the topic of today's hearing with an abundance of caution and reluctance, even skepticism and trepidation. On this issue, Congress might well heed the time-honored Hippocratic oath, first do no harm. As the Committee of Jurisdiction over Youth, Amateur, Collegiate, and Professional Sports, this committee seeks expert advice today as we decide which direction we begin to take for congressional action on the issue of NIL, compensation in college sports. More than 30 states have adopted, introduced, or signaled plans to introduce legislation allowing for student athletes to be compensated for the use of their NIL. I believe my colleagues recognize the need to avoid differences among the states by having a uniform set of standards by which our collegiate student athletes compete, a set of uniform standards that will strive for a level playing field. At the same time, we must recognize that any standards for the compensation of NIL must also provide protections for students, schools, and associations, particularly for the student athletes. We must be mindful of the law of unintended consequences. Human nature being what it is, we need to realize that some of our fellow mortals will seek and likely find loopholes for an unfair advantage. Over the last 4 months, I've spent hours on the phone with university presidents, athletic directors, and former collegiate athletes to help understand the current collegiate student-athlete system and how to approach a national policy on NIL. As part of that process, and in preparation for this hearing, I sent a list of 20 questions to 50 collegiate associations, conferences, universities, colleges, and service academies. We have summarized those responses and put that information on the committee's website. Without objection, I will enter that summary document into the record at this point. Hearing none, that will be done. In May, the NCAA Board of Governors Working Group issued a report on student-athlete compensation, the modernization of rules related to NIL, commercialization, and recommendations to Congress. We are grateful to have that input as well, and I ask unanimous consent to insert that into the record also. Without objection, it will be done. In almost every discussion I've had, the topic inevitably turns to a look at the many ways this issue might be abused or go awry. For example, will high school athletes choose to attend a university in a large media market because they believe it will generate more NIL value? How will universities or their supporters be prevented from manipulation of NIL contracts in the recruiting process? Will businesses invest in student-athlete NIL rights to promote a legitimate business or as an avenue to create access to athletes, coaches, and athletic programs? Will it be easier or harder for the star player on a team to put the team first, even when showcasing individual talent may increase NIL income? Will NIL result in a rise in student-athlete transfers to universities in bigger advertising markets? How will third parties contracting with student-athletes be regulated, and how will that impact schools' ability to ensure compliance and enforcement of NCAA rules? Is an 18-year-old emotionally and financially prepared to make all the choices required to enter into NIL contracts? What will be the impact of the student's academic obligations? Will permitting compensation for NIL further widen the gap between the haves and the have-nots among institutions of higher learning? And what about the effect on Title IX and women's sports? The list goes on and on. Let me single out Senator Moran for taking the first steps on this issue by holding a subcommittee hearing on NIL earlier this year. I know he shares with me the sense of importance and urgency this issue demands. I look forward to working with him and all of the members of the Commerce Committee as we move forward to seek a solution. Many questions remain. I hope our committee will gain a better understanding of these complicated issues and the challenges before us by means of these expert witnesses today. Let me again thank them for being here and recognize my dear friend and colleague, Ranking Member Cantwell, for her opening remarks. Senator Cantwell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for that long and thoughtful statement and a little bit of reminiscing about your own experiences. I consider myself a sports fan and definitely a collegial sports fan, but certainly one that sides with wanting to have amateur athleticism and to make sure that we're keeping amateur athleticism. If anything, I feel like we should be doing more as a committee in our oversight of the violations of that athleticism and amateurism that occur all the time. And mark me down as not a fan of one and done, but somebody who really believes in the collegial system, as you said, of giving athletes an experience of leadership, teamwork, building all sorts of character that I hope that we can continue to preserve as we look at this legislation. And I want to thank our witnesses for being here today, too. I know you come from a breadth and depth of experiences on these issues. At the outset, I hope that we have a chance to talk about the current healthcare crisis as we are moving closer to the beginning of the academic year and know that the pandemic is not relenting. I want to make sure we're putting into place safeguards to protect our student athletes as we look forward to what the collegial environment might be this fall. So I'll have a chance to ask people about this. This issue of compensation for student athletes is a complex one, as the chairman just mentioned, with strong feelings on both sides and growing legal battles in the courtrooms and state legislatures around the country. Despite its complexity, It is impossible to ignore the simple facts that these athletes do produce billions of dollars of value for the NCAA and member institutions and aren't able to market themselves as other athletes, students would be. So the status quo is especially jarring as we look at this national reckoning on racial justice and civil rights issues and want to understand the impacts of the NIL on all athletes. So I look forward to the discussion and potential solutions that we're going to talk about today. I am not a fan of an NCAA antitrust exemption. I think that quashing all momentum for change with this blunt legal instrument is both unnecessary and ill-advised. Similarly, I oppose the Congress fully deferring to the NCAA on just coming up with the rules on name, image, and likeness. I think Congress should not abdicate its role, and I think the chairman's very thoughtful discussion and hard work on this shows that we need to have some input and oversight to make sure it's done right. The chairman just articulated a long list of complexity to the issue, which I very much appreciate his understanding and the delicate balance that so many institutions have already tried to achieve by complying with the rules that are on the books today. And so I agree with the chairman that we don't want to see a new system in which violations would occur because somebody sees a new avenue to promote a competitive edge in what is hopefully as balanced as we can get. But again, like I said, I think we should have more oversight on these issues. So how can we find a solution that preserves both the character of college sports while also providing athletes with well-deserved rights? So, as I said, I believe in preserving amateurism and that athletes would be able to grow. And I look forward to hearing Professor Kohler's comments on this issue and exactly how we can achieve this. I believe Congress should take the time to get this right. It must be an open process. Hundreds of thousands of current athletes and millions of future athletes and their families are depending on it. And as the chairman said, this is a long tradition. It's part of our culture. These institutions, these athletic events, and we don't want to turn them into one more avenue of, again, people just gaming a system on behalf of the athletes and then leaving the athletes, again, without their own recourse. So I'll look forward to seeing this set of solutions that we can agree on, and I hope that we can also, at some point in time, Mr. Chairman, look more closely at mechanisms to ensure that female athletes have the same opportunity to earn compensation as their male colleagues. I think this is an important issue that deserves its own hearing and deserves its own focus, and hopefully we can get to that at some future date. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator Cantwell. And now the written statements by all five of our witnesses will be entered into the record in their entirety. We ask each witness to summarize their testimony in 5 minutes. And of course, Mr. Winston will be joining us remotely. So we'll just begin at the left end of the table here and proceed down the table. Mr. Carter, you are recognized.
Chairman Wicker, Ranking Member Cantwell, and the members of the Commerce Committee, good morning. My name is Keith Carter, and I'm the Vice Chancellor for Intercollegiate Athletics at the University of Mississippi, or more commonly referred to in athletic circles as Ole Miss. It is certainly an honor and a privilege to represent our great university, the Southeastern Conference, and other athletics directors and student athletes from across the country regarding name, image, and likeness. I would like to thank Senator Wicker for inviting me to testify today, and to everyone on the committee for your interest and the attention as we look to work together and answer your questions regarding this timely and critical issue for student athletes across the country, the need for a federal legislation that provides a uniform standard for name, image, and likeness nationwide. I believe it is time for intercollegiate athletics to find a pathway forward. Legislation of this magnitude dealing with student athletes' personal image and how a compensation model could potentially be implemented must be done in a deliberate, thoughtful, and inclusive manner, as it will shape the future of intercollegiate athletics. Athletics has been a vital part of my life since I was 5 years old. Growing up, I played baseball and basketball and ultimately had an opportunity to pursue a lifelong dream of competing at the highest level and fulfill a goal of completing my undergraduate degree. I was recruited by numerous schools and chose to be a student athlete at the University of Mississippi. When I played basketball at Ole Miss, I enjoyed the student athlete experience. While the schedule was rigorous, class, study hall, weight training, practice, and certainly competition, the student athlete experience shaped and molded me into the person that I am today. I also noticed during my time as a student athlete that my image and presence grew as I improved as a player and as my team became more successful. I was more recognized on campus and within the community. Interview requests increased, public appearances increased, and looking back, there would have been some level of market value for myself and my teammates. Today, the landscape has drastically changed. Whether it's social media, endorsements, or promotions, our student athletes have an unprecedented opportunity to capitalize on their name, image, and likeness, similar to thousands of other students with whom they attend college. After finishing my basketball career in Europe, I realized that I wanted to be back on a college campus working in an athletic department. Being a product of college athletics and having a real-life story of how much my student athlete experience prepared me for the future, I felt a great obligation to give back. Special people such as coaches, administrators, professors, and countless others made a difference in my life. I wanted to use my experience as a student athlete and the lessons I learned along the way to help other young men and women achieve their goals. As I've moved into a leadership role as athletics director at my alma mater, I take great pride in listening to student athletes. I often get questions about the opportunity to benefit from their NIL in the same way that their non-athlete classmates do and the timing around any potential legislation. What does this model look like? It is obviously very complex, but we have an opportunity to shape what this could look like and ensure that unintended consequences do not cause long-lasting ripple effects on the ability to support our almost 400 student athletes. It is also vitally important that the governance structure be formed around federal legislation to ensure that each state, and therefore each university in the nation, has a uniform framework that continues to focus on education and the unique appeal of the current amateur model. Ensuring that our student athletes remain students and college athletics does not become pay for play, essentially another professional league, is essential in any potential solution. In my opinion, the preferred NIL system involves third-party compensation only, where colleges and universities are not allowed to pay for or otherwise facilitate NIL opportunities for their student athletes. Another important component of any new legislation must ensure that NIL opportunities are kept out of the recruiting process. Absent sufficient regulatory framework, NIL opportunities could be used as improper inducements during recruiting that could deter prospective student athletes from appropriately considering the academic and athletic opportunities a particular university may offer him or her. Regulation of agents and boosters in facilitating or offering NIL opportunities is also essential to a healthy framework. We come before you today to speak to the need for federal legislation to provide a baseline consistency for this much-needed opportunity. Our goal is to work with you to put forth a national framework and, first and foremost, protect the interests of all student athletes, both male and female, preserve the amateur model of intercollegiate athletics, safeguard the recruiting process, and ultimately provide equal opportunities for all student athletes to benefit from their NIL in the very same manner as their non-athlete classmates. Thank you again for this opportunity. Ultimately, we believe that more can and should be done for our student athletes, but it must be done in a way that continues to promote education and give consistent opportunities for all. I look forward to working toward a solution and enhancing the lives of our student athletes in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Carter. Dr. Drake, welcome.
Thank you very much, and good morning, Chairman Ricker, Ranking Member Cantwell. Yeah, I had a green light. I was sorry. I was thinking go. Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Good to see you today, and Ranking Member Cantwell, good morning. Members of the committee, on behalf of the National Collegiate Athletic Association and the Ohio State University, where I was introduced as the chairman or the president emeritus, which has been the case for about 10 and a half hours. So I appreciate my new short-lived status. But I appreciate your interest in the important issue of compensating student athletes related to name, image, and likeness. As a medical doctor and a 20-year member of the National Academy of Medicine, I have testified before as a subject area expert, and I'm grateful to do so again. In spring 2019, interest in this issue heightened with the introduction of federal and state legislation that would permit student athletes to be compensated for use of their NIL. The NCAA Board of Governors established an NCAA federal and state legislation working group in May 2019 to examine this issue and develop recommendations. In October 2019, the NCAA Board of Governors unanimously supported the working group's recommendations and began the process of modernizing its rules to allow students participating in athletics the opportunity to benefit from the use of their NIL. As outlined in my testimony, the association's ability to move forward is hampered by three factors that we encourage you to focus on today. Specifically, we're asking for your partnership to preempt state bills on NIL with differing provisions and start dates so that there is a uniform standard and approach. 2, to protect universities and conferences from antitrust litigation that adversely affects our ability to effectively and efficiently support the evolving needs of student athletes. And 3, to protect amateurism in college sports that is guided by longstanding values of education, opportunity, well-being, and fairness. I would like to recognize the attention that members of this committee and others in Congress are giving to the issue of name, image, and likeness and collegiate athletics. I also want to recognize Ohio Congressman Anthony Gonzalez, an Ohio State alumnus, an outstanding collegiate and professional football player, for his support of student athletes and the work that he has done around this issue. Together, we can enact and implement legislation that will provide a uniform name, image, and likeness approach. I believe this action will result in fair and uniform competition for all student athletes and protect and ensure opportunities for future student athletes. Thank you.
Thank you. And our next witness, I bet, likes to have her name pronounced correctly. So, Kohler.
Kohler.
Okay, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank
Glad
you,
to have
Mr.
with
Chairman.
us.
Chairman Wicker, Ranking Member Cantwell, and members of the committee, my name is Dion Kohler, and I'm a professor of law and the director of the Center for Sport and the Law at the University of Baltimore. I am also a former athlete and the proud parent of an NCAA Division III athlete. Thank you for inviting me here to speak with you about these important issues. For decades, Congress and courts have deferred to the NCAA to build a model for intercollegiate sports that has grown into a multi-billion-dollar industry. The NCAA calls this the American model. Courts are increasingly calling it a violation of antitrust law. Today, the NCAA purports to seek legislation so that it can preserve what it defines as amateurism. In reality, it seeks to preserve the cartel profits that an unnecessarily restrictive amateurism model yields. This committee should not be moved. The action sought by the NCAA would not only cause further harm to athletes, but ultimately to the entire college sports enterprise. It is a model that is literally breaking under the weight of its own injustice. The decades of excesses and abuses perpetrated under the guise of amateurism are well known, and at times have been the subject of congressional hearings and reports, including the series of reports Senator Murphy released last year. The profound unfairness of this model is even more apparent considering that it is Black men, often from socioeconomically disadvantaged backgrounds, who disproportionately provide the labor that pays predominantly white coaches and administrators bloated above-market salaries. The NCAA model, therefore, is not just an economic issue, it is increasingly a social justice issue. Today, the NCAA and college sports interests are asking Congress for even more than deference. They are asking for an unprecedented level of insulation from the free market rules that nearly every other American industry must follow. Granting this extraordinary request is not at all necessary to preserve the many benefits that intercollegiate sports provides. There is no urgency presented by this issue. While a federal solution to the name, image, likeness issue could be useful, competitive balance and the NCAA model are not irreparably threatened by state legislation. In addition, if any guardrails are necessary, the NCAA should not be the ones to craft them. Athletes can, like other students on campus, enter the free market and strike deals for the use of their name, image, and likeness. The only guardrails needed in this situation are those provided by federal antitrust law that would prevent the NCAA from imposing unreasonable restraints on trade in the name of amateurism. Rather than seeking protection from Congress to impose economic restraints on athletes, the NCAA should craft rules that better support athletes' health, safety, and well-being. Indeed, if athletes are currently able to sign waivers to facilitate their return to practice during a global health pandemic, they should be permitted to make deals to market their name, image, and likeness. The NCAA also asserts that NIL rights for athletes could somehow threaten the gains made by Title IX. This is surely not the case. In fact, these rights would promote and not undermine gender equity. To promote gender equity, the NCAA and its member institutions should instead focus on Title IX compliance, something that has yet to be fully realized. Perhaps most importantly, an antitrust exemption is not warranted here. The NCAA often asserts that an exemption is necessary to prevent vague, unsubstantiated predictions of harm to the amateurism model. Antitrust cases, however, have documented that the NCAA's overly restrictive rules produce very real, demonstrable harm to athletes and the free market. An antitrust exemption would therefore serve to shield an industry that has struggled to demonstrate that its anti-competitive restraints on athletes, in fact, are fully necessary to produce college sports. Finally, this committee is well aware that unchecked power by sports regulators too often leads to cultures that harm athletes and threaten the games themselves. The example of the United States Olympic and Paralympic Committee is instructive. I applaud this committee for its work to address these issues, most recently with bills such as the Equal Pay for Team USA Act. Through the important leadership of this committee, Congress has taken significant steps to protect athletes and restore confidence in the U.S. Olympic movement, and it has the opportunity to do the same for intercollegiate sports. In conclusion, in nearly every context where athletes have advanced arguments for fundamental fairness, equality, and the protection of their health and well-being, sports regulators like the NCAA have countered with dire predictions that sport itself would be threatened. The predicted harm never materializes. History has shown that initiatives which promote athletes' rights have strengthened the integrity, sustainability, and popularity of sports, and I have no doubt that allowing intercollegiate athletes the right to market their name, image, and likeness without unnecessary restriction by the NCAA will do the same. I thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Ms. Kohler. Commissioner Sankey, you are recognized, sir.
Thank you, Chairman Wicker, and thank you, Ranking Member Cantwell and distinguished members of the committee. On behalf of the Southeastern Conference, I appreciate the opportunity to visit on the important topic of student-athlete name, image, and likeness. My name is Greg Sankey, and I've served as Commissioner of the Southeastern Conference since June of 2015. That is part of a 33-year career in college athletics, including work on a small Division III campus in upstate New York, a small Division I football playing university in Natchitoches, Louisiana, being commissioner of the Southland Conference with universities in Texas and Louisiana, and now with the SEC. My objective is to share the important view that we must get this name, image, and likeness issue right in order to ensure that we are able to provide opportunities for many young women and young men, both now and in the future, and that we preserve the characteristics of college athletics that make it unique, appealing, and important to so many in our country. In reality, this issue presents unique and challenging complexities that can be misunderstood and may result in those unintended consequences that have been identified. And so I offer the following for your consideration. First, as we implement these NIL changes, our student athletes must remain students and not become employees of colleges and universities. We must continue to emphasize their academic progress as students, particularly as we add additional responsibilities upon an already busy schedule. Second, we must not allow college athletics to devolve into a pay-for-play system. This means prohibiting colleges and universities from paying student athletes directly or indirectly for their name, image, and likeness rights. The California NIL law, which is scheduled to take effect in 2023, allows just that, or even university head coaches to purchase student athlete name, image, and likeness rights and provide that compensation to members of their team once they enroll. That's simply a pay-for-play model. Third, the reality is there's no draft process in college sports, which means we must keep NIL activity out of recruiting. In practical terms, this means federal legislation must preclude athletic department boosters from using name, image, and likeness compensation as a recruiting inducement for high school students or for college students contemplating a transfer to another institution. Fourth, we need to enact meaningful protections for student athletes. The reality is outside parties will have great interest in taking advantage of student athletes who lack experience in making business decisions, selecting agents, determining advisors, and other experience in evaluating whether a deal is just too good to refuse. Finally, we need a federal law to address these issues because college athletics needs a uniform system for regulating name, image, and likeness activities, as 50 different state laws will not support national competition or national championships in a fair and effective manner. Also, I believe our high school athletes being recruited nationally by multiple universities and multiple states need to understand one clear standard for evaluating their name, image, and likeness opportunities. And we need protection from claims and liability arising from the implementation of new NIL standards and from continual challenges to the validity of NCAA rules, which we have discussed in a more lengthy manner in my response to Senator Wicker's questions and in my written testimony. We seek protection from claims related to implementation of federal legislation that will create opportunities for student athletes. We seek to work with this committee and others in Congress to produce a federal law that provides a path for student athletes to benefit from their name, image, and likeness in a way that will preserve the key tenets of college athletics, create a uniform national standard, and protect the stakeholders from potential liability. In 33 years of working in college athletics, I've learned many things, but at the top of the list is we're not perfect, yet we do some incredible things in college sports. We provide opportunities. We provide education for young people. We engage our public. We celebrate achievement. And we guide students as they transition from adolescence to adulthood. We do all of that very well. I look forward to working with you to continue these successes, and thank you for the opportunity to have this conversation.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. And now, remotely, we are joined by Mr. Eric Winston. Sir, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you, Senator.
No, you are recognized, and we appreciate you being with us.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, ranking member, and members of the committee. And thank you for inviting me today and allowing me to attend virtually for this important discussion on economic rights and problem solving. I join you today not as a former college and NFL football player, but as an advocate for helping everyone in college athletics come up with a fair and equitable system around the name, image, and likeness of college athletes. The conversation is one that I am familiar with from my playing days at the University of Miami in the early 2000s. When I was at Miami, the Orange Bowl was sold out for every game. We played in front of massive television audiences and were covered by the national media every day. That attention shined a spotlight on the program, increased the popularity of the school, and generated large sums of revenue. Sales of team and player product went through the roof. Broadcasters and sponsors spent millions annually to be a part of the experience. All of those positive things were a result of the players and the team's success. Away from the bright lights and success of the playing field, however, was a far different story. That side involved players like me struggling to maintain a full schedule of classes while balancing requirements for daily training, rehab, and preparation to remain at an elite level. While people are more aware today of the challenges and demands of competitive athletics, there is still a notion in some corners that we are merely just lucky to get a scholarship. The reality is that there is very little time for scholarship. In fact, the more successful we were, the greater the pressure and the demands. Most of us knew life would be something like once we signed up our college scholarship, nonstop and pressure-packed. But what we didn't know was that for our year-round effort to win games and pack stadiums, drive media, maximize TV contracts, raise booster money, and create revenue to the school, the conference, and the NCAA, we would hardly have enough money to pay for our basic living expenses. We received a scholarship check for the months that we were in class, 10 checks. I was forced to save a fraction of every check to make up the difference during the other 2 months to pay for all my expenses. The stipend was hardly enough to cover necessities. Every month, every dollar was stretched. While some things have changed since then, I know college athletes still face these issues. After school, I transitioned to the NFL and worked hard to have a distinguished 12-year career in the NFL, including a 6-year tenure as the NFLPA president. At the NFLPA, I came to understand the value of group commercial activity and how everyone can benefit from incremental revenue generated. From there, my career path led me to One Team Partners because I know that the issues that existed during my college days are not fixed, and I want to be part of that solution. For the benefit of the committee, One Team Partners represents the group rights of male and female athletes from across pro sports, from the NFL, MLB, MLS, to the WNBA, U.S. Women's Soccer, and U.S. Rugby. And we believe college group licensing is the logical first step into the NIL space and, frankly, low-hanging fruit, which can be implemented rather seamlessly. Our team has the experience, expertise, and resources to maximize the opportunities for both the athletes and the institutions for which they play. A thoughtful group licensing program is a win-win for everyone involved. Schools and athletic departments can benefit from new revenue streams such as video games, trading cards, and the athletes can pocket some money to ease the worries about where their next meal is going to come from, and the fans can benefit from officially licensed products. Innovation in this space is so important right now, and change in college athletics is already here. We can resist this change in the evolving big business of college athletics, or we can work together to create a fair and equitable system that puts the headlines back where they belong, on the sports themselves. Athletes are driving the business already, so we need to get on board and support them. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Winston, and thank you all. And now we'll begin a series of questions. We'll use the 5-minute round. Mr. Carter, you attended Ole Miss just a few years before Mr. Winston attended Miami. Is that correct?
Correct.
And he listed a pretty tough set of circumstances, little time for study, coaches grilling us in the film room for hours and hours, very sketchy allowance for expenses and having to check the bank account to see if you could pay for living expenses, only receiving those checks 10 months out of the year rather than 12. Is that something you recognize in your collegiate career, and has that changed since that time?
Yes, sir. That's a great question, and I would agree with Eric on that from a standpoint of when I was in school, there were times when you didn't have a lot of money in your pocket. Your scholarship check, a lot of those things. You had the essentials. You had your room and board paid for. You had a lot of those things done, but the extracurricular activities, sometimes you didn't have the money to pay for those. And, again, I do think things have changed a lot since the late 90s when I was at Ole Miss. I look at some of the things that our student athletes have now with unlimited meals, with cost of attendance checks that were implemented, 3 or 4 years ago. I do feel like there are... Each institution basically decides how much of cost of attendance they want to pay, and for us, we pay up to the full amount for each student athlete. And so, for us, we think that we're providing a lot of resources, and obviously we're here today to discuss opportunities to provide, potentially more resources, which I think is a great thing. But I would say, without a doubt, student athletes now are in a much better place from a lot of the things Mr. Winston mentioned than maybe when he and I were in school.
Yeah, you provided a list of benefits for a scholarship athlete at the University of Mississippi in your written testimony. What does the average Ole Miss basketball scholarship recipient receive today? What's the entire compensation package?
Well, for an out-of-state student, a non-resident student,
like you were.
Yes, exactly. You're looking at about $42,000 just for the tuition and all the things that go along with cost of attendance there. We've calculated that there's probably about another $25,000 that would go to a student athlete on an annual basis based on whether it be medical situations, academic services, strength and conditioning, a lot of the things that, for example, these students were professional athletes, they would have to pay for. And so we feel like that the total number at Ole Miss that our full ride head count student athletes get is around $68,000 to $70,000.
And what about, is there some provision for most universities for day-to-day living expenses, being able to run downtown and eat at a restaurant, things like that?
Yes, sir. I think that, again, there are, certainly the fact that a lot more meals are provided now, things that maybe, again, when Mr. Winston and I were in school that we had to pay for out of a scholarship check or those type of things. Now there are incidental meals. There's basically unlimited meals. There's snacks. Basically our student athletes, anywhere they turn around on our campus, in our athletic facilities, they have an opportunity to grab food, which allows them to have more money in their pocket to spend on other things. And then, as I mentioned, 3 or 4 years ago, when basically the full cost of attendance option was available, that's allowing, in the state of Mississippi where we are in Oxford, it's about $4,800 per student athlete per year. So again, more money in their pocket, and obviously we're here to talk about doing more, but I do feel like over the years we've done a lot to enhance the experience of our student athletes, and certainly I know that it's been a good thing.
What's your graduation rate among scholarship athletes at Ole Miss?
We're very high. We're up in the 80 percentile, which is obviously higher than the normal student population. We have job placement. We placed 100% of our graduating seniors last year that had jobs as they left our institution. There's so many resources that are available to the student athletes besides just the actual scholarship itself. We talk about.
What's that figure in the SEC, Mr. Sankey?
It will vary. So we'll have programs or universities that are at or near 100% graduation rate, and we'll trail down into the 80s. Perhaps I think the lowest off the top of my head is in the high 70s from a percentage rate, and that doesn't include, that's a 6-year window analysis. It doesn't include post-eligibility returns, which over the last 5 years are in the hundreds of opportunities provided for young people to come back and complete their degrees.
Thank you very much. Senator Cantwell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Professor Kohler, I couldn't agree with you more on amateurism and protecting amateurism, and that we should be doing more oversight of this issue, not less. I feel like there's a lot of things that happen that don't get the bright light of day shown on them, and so we should take that opportunity. How do you think that name, image, and likeness and amateurism can work together? And what kind of oversight do you think is necessary to make sure that the students are, or the athletes are, have their rights independently protected?
Senator, I think name, image, and likeness can work with the amateurism model, but where I part company with some of the NCAA suggestions is who should be in the business of enforcing that and writing the restrictions. And so what the NCAA Board of Governors report is asking for is a blank check to the NCAA to write the restrictions. I think that either Congress can write restrictions on NIL use into legislation, or, for instance, some have proposed an independent commission that could be in charge of that. So I think the blank check to the NCAA to come up with restrictions on NIL use is suspect, given that all the terrific benefits Mr. Carter's talked about that student athletes now receive, those benefits were really the result of antitrust litigation. So I think it can work together, but I think we need an independent body coming up with the necessary safeguards, so to speak, and enforcement.
And how do you protect the athletes, on the amateurism issue in and of itself?
So there are lots of ways to protect athletes in an amateurism system. So if you're talking specifically about name, image, and likeness, you can have prohibitions on schools setting up these deals for their athletes. You can have prohibitions on using these deals as recruiting enhancements. I think there are a lot of ways that you can do that. You can write it into legislation, or you can have an independent commission do it. But again, what the NCAA has asked for through its Board of Governors report is a far more sort of expansive definition of that, and I think that's unnecessary.
I mentioned this issue of the pandemic, and so, Dr. Drake, will you allow students to refuse to compete or participate in college-mandated activities because of COVID?
Absolutely. The participation is voluntary, of course.
Okay, so,
Senator.
but why am I seeing this thing called the Buckeye Pledge? Returning students sign a liability waiver before participating in
Oh, thank you,
athletic.
Senator. Let me just say that they do not sign the liability waiver. That's just not true. It's a pledge that all of our students are going to be signing to basically follow the good public health guidelines that you and I and everyone should follow to help protect us against this, against the pandemic. In fact, the guidelines are exactly parallel to the CDC-issued guidelines that came out just yesterday. And what the pledge says is that you'll wear a mask when you're in public, you'll wash your hands, you'll keep 6 feet of distance, and if you become ill, you report this to people to allow you to be protected.
So a football player could say, I don't want to participate in this fall season and not have any of his compensation or,
Yes,
Yeah,
a scholarship, specifically in the pledge, it says that this will not affect your scholarship. Whether or not you participate will not affect your scholarship.
okay, so it's
Specifically written to say that.
Ms.
So it's a
Kohler?
pledge, not a waiver, which I would not support.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Kohler, do you have any comments about this?
Well, I certainly don't want to challenge Dr. Drake on what the intent is behind the Buckeye Pledge, and as an administrator myself trying to bring students back to campus, I know that we need to have some collective understandings of public health, so I think that's very important. I would say as a lawyer and a law professor, however, the Buckeye Pledge, and I don't want to focus on that too much. I think the University of Tennessee has an actually worded release of liability that is deeply concerning, and other schools do as well. But even things like the Buckeye Pledge, which are important for public health, I think can cross over and be used later on down the line to be sort of an assumption of the risk.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Thune.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sankey, would your conference today be able to comply with several state laws seeking to address the issue of name, image, and likeness?
It would be difficult and confusing, and a piece of my concern is we have one in our region. And knowing the competition within my 11 states, I can foresee quickly the other 10 one-upping each other, and I think that's a problem for fair and equitable competition.
Is there anybody here on the panel that does not believe that there is a need for a nationwide standard?
No.
I know you've kind of suggested, Ms. Kohler, not to the extent that others are perhaps advocating.
Yeah, it's not an emergency, but I think it's desirable, certainly.
Okay. Mr. Drake, when Dr. Emmert testified before the committee earlier this year, he stated that he envisioned each individual division having some degree of control over the rules to allow athletes to benefit from their name, image, and likeness as long as they followed a larger set of parameters established by the NCAA Board of Governors. Is that how you envision the rule working?
Yes, the divisions have different rules because they have different rules on scholarships and other things, so there would be modifications to distinguish the divisions 1, 2, and 3, Senator, but there'd be an overarching framework that would guide this.
As those rules are being set, what steps are each of the respective divisions taking to ensure that fair and balanced competition continues between the larger and the smaller schools?
Yes, thank you, Senator. What's happening now, in fact, is that each of the divisions is working on its recommendations for the details of the policy that will come to the Board of Governors in October, and those are the kind of details they're focusing on now.
All right. It's been suggested that there should be a limit on the amount of funds a potential NIL sponsor can offer a student to protect students from inappropriate predatory actions. Do you all agree with that? Limits? Okay.
Well, let's let every witness answer, including Mr. Winston. Would each witness support a limit on the amount of NIL compensation a student athlete could receive? Ms. Kohler?
I don't support a limit on the amount of compensation. I can see a need for some common sense limits on the ways that these deals come to be, so they're not recruitment inducements and other things, but I don't support limiting the compensation.
That was your question, right?
Correct, yeah.
Okay, well, let's let the other three members answer. Dr. Drake.
Thank you, Senator. Yeah, I just common sense limits so that you couldn't get $50,000 for whatever, a T-shirt. I mean, just common sense limits that would be, I think I agree with Ms. Kohler on that.
I started to lean in, Senator, and then I was waiting to see how the answer was going to play out. I do believe there needs to be a structure around how this is deployed, some of which have been identified. I've not envisioned simply a numerical limit. I think sources are important to consider for limitations. I think the nature of those relationships that might be in legislation should be considered. I've had conversations generally about a numerical limit, and that's not been the focus of our thinking at this point.
And I would just add to that, we talked a lot about market value and giving our student athletes the same opportunities as non-student athletes. So I think that you would refer back to the market value, and certainly some common sense approach, and the structure needs to be there, but the market value is where we would fall back to.
And Mr.
Senator, I'll jump in here. Yeah, I'll jump in here as well. I don't see a need for a limit per se. Obviously, when we think about common sense thought processes around how that's paid out, or restrictions around it, I would echo what Mr. Carter and Ms. Kohler have said on this already.
And Senator Thune, I've taken some of your time, so you go ahead and take another 2 or 3 minutes.
No, that's all right. That's a good. It was good to get that answer on the record in more specific terms. Let me ask you, and this is for any of you, whether you believe that rules around name, image, and likeness should affect the college athletic recruitment process. And the second question is, will it affect the college recruitment process?
The will it part, it absolutely has the potential. And that's why in my comments I observed the need to address the issue specifically. And I view that in several ways. One, if this activity is around recruitment, it's simply an inducement, and we lose the conversations that currently occur in recruiting around education, around geography, around the nature and support of the program, and it becomes transactional. I think that is legitimately a concern that we should have. The difficult part is to create, whether it's guardrails, fencing, framework for that limitation within legislation, and then to monitor that activity in a way that eliminates it or reduces it from recruiting. And I think it's not simply an issue for high school students. I also think with what will be a freer environment for transfer student athletes, that same type of recruiting activity transfers itself to the college level under an unstructured name, image, and likeness atmosphere.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, if I may, I'm the son of a college athlete. My father went to college on a college scholarship, wouldn't have gone to college otherwise. He went because he wanted to play football, not because he wanted to go to college. And then actually he graduated from college, which he had never thought of, and then practiced medicine, got a medical degree and practiced medicine until he was 99 years old. So it changed his life, and it changed my life and our family's lives. And so the pathway was extraordinarily important. And I'm also then the father of a Division I collegiate athlete, now graduated and a visiting professor at NYU. But I remember the recruitment process. He heard from 300 colleges when he was in high school, and was recruited very actively by colleges in different states, and then made a decision at the college he wanted to go to. And it turned out to be a wonderful process for him, very affirming for him, and then gave him the ability to look across the country and pick the best match. And I think that's a great part of this process. You're not drafted and pointed to one team. I have a nephew who played in the NFL for 6 years, and I've watched that process as well. And it's quite a different process than the recruitment process. So I think that that's something that needs to be protected. And we've seen with the laws that have passed already that people in those states have been referring to, the state of Florida in particular, referring to Florida now as a place that students, athletes ought to come because of the NIL laws that would take place in Florida before others. And so this one-upsmanship, as Commissioner Sankey has mentioned, has already started.
And that would be one of the biggest concerns I have as representing a state where you've got some schools that are mid-major conference schools, Division II, NAIA, is how it could affect the ability of some of those really quality schools, many of which have attracted athletes from the region for many of the benefits that you all have talked about. If this becomes a money issue, how that could impact that recruiting process. And I think that's something we have to be really careful of, aware of, as we work through this issue. And I will tell you, it's come a long ways. My dad was a Division I athlete, played at the University of Minnesota back in the late 30s and early 40s. He is one of the, in fact, he's 100 years old, and he, I think, by far is the only athlete still alive from that when he was competing in the Big Ten. But at that time, the idea of a scholarship was you worked for your room and board. He worked at a fraternity to make his board. So that was it's changed a lot, and it's great that these athletes have these opportunities. But we certainly want to make sure that this is done in a way that doesn't create a lot of potential for bad things to happen. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Thune. My dad was a junior college athlete back before World War II, and it indeed, he will tell you at age 96 that it changed his life. Senator Tester, you are next. I'm guessing you ran cross-country in college.
Pretty close. Well, I'm just going to tell you, my dad was a farmer and a meat cutter and lived to be darn near 89, so it's a good thing. Hey, guys, first of all, I want to thank all of you for testifying. I appreciate it. We need to stay in touch on this issue. I agree with Senator Thune about it's got to be equitable. You cannot give advantages to the moneyed conferences, so to speak. If it does, we haven't done our job. But more importantly, it has to be fair to the athlete, and I think that's why we're all here. My first question is for Mr. Sankey. Mr. Sankey, could you very briefly tell me the differences that you see between the Florida law and the NCAA's proposal on NIL?
Well, I think the challenge with what the NCAA has put together right now is it is principle-based, where Florida's law is operationalized. From my perspective, the Florida law is pretty effective. I think it's an improvement over what you've seen out of California. We obviously, through our university, had an opportunity to be in conversation about that law. I think the challenge for the NCAA's working group report is how to actually legislate the rules, in a way that would withstand legal scrutiny, and one that would satisfy the extent, for instance, of the California law, which I've never thought is possible. And so my basis for believing there needs to be a federal law is that these differences are significant. In particular, the effective date of the Florida law being next summer is of great significance in needing to move this along in a time-efficient manner.
Gotcha. But what you're basically saying is the issue here isn't necessarily the law itself, and don't let me put words in your mouth. It isn't necessarily the law itself, it's the fact that it needs to be a nationwide law. Any law that we have, there has to be able to preempt. So you guys know the rule of the road for every state you're recruiting.
Yes, from my perspective, Florida did what I would consider to be a pretty good job. They can't preempt other state laws, obviously, and they can't deal with some of the legal issues I've identified today. The agent oversight is a concern still from that law. And I think that's one of the challenges that would be present even with a federal law, is how do we oversee and hold agents or representatives accountable to standards in the right sort of fashion in real time.
Gotcha. Well, when Senator Moran had the hearing early on, a few months back, we talked about a catastrophic injury fund. Mr. Sankey, this is for you. Do you think that if we do something on NIL that would prevent, are you asking us that it would prevent us from doing anything else on like an injury fund for injured athletes?
But no, not at this time. I'm not familiar with that exact conversation. I know of the fund. And in fact, as a conference, our institutions explore disability insurance and loss of value insurance for student athletes on a regular basis.
I guess what I'm asking you is if we do a bill on NIL that is a national bill, you do not see that as preempting Congress from doing something in some other area to help athletes outside of NIL, for example, an injury.
I'll do the dangerous thing, which is to say, no, I don't, but I don't know enough of the details to be the expert at this point. But no, I don't react to that negatively in this moment.
That's good enough for me. Ms. Kohler, aside from name, image, and likeness and taking care of injured athletes, do you see any other issues that need to be part of a compensation discussion?
Well, I think we've discussed the issues in terms of compensation, but I think what needs to be part of the conversation is really athlete health and safety and well-being and national standards in that area as well. So I think that's part of what my testimony was, that we shouldn't be so rushed to simply move on NIL that we forget, and Congress has held hearings on things like national standards for treatment of concussions. Heat stroke, sports medicine. You know, we have thousands of different approaches to how athlete health care is delivered because of the NCAA's decentralized model. So what I would say is that as you look for a national solution and work toward a national solution on NIL, you not forget these other important issues.
Mr. Winston, first of all, I appreciate your career. You played for Tampa Bay, right?
Houston, mostly. Houston, Cincinnati.
Okay, well, and I don't think you weigh near what you did back in your playing. But what I wanted to ask you is the schedule that you laid out didn't include much for academics. I have heard this from other athletes that if you're a scholarship student, that your first obligation is to that sport, and it's just the nature of the beast. I'm not being critical of college. What I'm saying is that pretty much it? Football comes first in your case, or basketball, or cross country, or whatever you might be, and academics kind of fill in the gaps?
Yeah, I always somewhat joke that I was an athletic student, not necessarily a student athlete. It's a tough schedule. It's something that I think we understand from even coming from high school, especially if you're at a big high school program. There's not a lot of time for extracurriculars either. Doesn't make it okay, but I think it's an understanding that you're right. I mean, you have a study hall until 9 o'clock, and you go to bed, and then you get up at 6 a.m. the next day, and you start it again, right? And that's something that unfortunately, quite frankly, maybe we get used to. Some guys really thrive in that structure, to be completely frank. But at the same time, you're right. It's a complete balancing act every day.
Okay.
Thank you,
Last
Senator
thing,
Tester.
I know. I just need to get from Mr. Winston his college group licensing proposal, just so I can take a look at it and see.
Yeah, I'm happy to send it.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you, Senator Tester. Senator Cruz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to each of the witnesses for being here and for your good work. There are a lot of reasons people choose to come to Texas, and one of them is to play sports. And in Texas, we take our sports very seriously. Indeed, ESPN still ranks as the greatest national championship game ever. The game in 2005 when the Texas Longhorns and Vince Young stunned USC, and the Heisman Trophy winner, Reggie Bush, and I'll tell you, Heidi and I were at that game in the Rose Bowl. And I, for one, agree with ESPN that there's never been a game like it. Texas is a home to 53 colleges and universities whose student athletes compete at the NCAA level. 23 are Division I. Of those 23 Division I schools, 6 are in the Power 5 conferences, the ACC, the Big 10, the Big 12, the Pac-12, and the SEC. 4 of those 6 are right now the reigning national champions in at least one sport. One of the challenges of this issue that each of y'all are considering is how is it going to impact parity and competitiveness between big schools and wealthy schools and those that may not be as big and may not be as wealthy. Texas is home to a number of schools that are not in the Power 5. For example, the University of Houston, a phenomenal basketball school, and Phi Slamma Jamma was as great a collegiate program. Yeah, I'm using it as an opportunity to revel in old memories.
Get to the point.
But the University of Houston's in the American Athletic Conference. Dr. Drake, in your opinion, should the NCAA determine an NIL policy that will apply to all member schools, and how do you avoid giving additional advantages to large and wealthy programs?
Well, thank you, Senator. That is one of the concerns in the NIL program. There issues would be large, wealthy programs in urban areas versus programs in rural areas, et cetera. And these are the devilish details that are being worked out to try to get as much parity as there can be. There's not total parity as we speak, but the idea is to try to move forward to something that gives more opportunity for student athletes without disadvantaging institutions unnecessarily, with the focus on the student athlete.
it seems to me that if the NCAA is going to consider this initiative, that two guiding principles ought to be looked to. Number one, fairness. Being fair to student athletes, and student athletes undoubtedly put enormous time and energy and dedication, and a great many of those student athletes are not going to go on to a professional career. And fairness is certainly important. A whole lot of revenues being generated, often by the quite literally the sweat of their brow. And so fairness matters, but at the same time, preserving competitiveness. I think a test of success would be the competitiveness we see in sports today, that any change in policy wouldn't significantly alter it, to just draw all the money and power in a handful of schools and disadvantage the others. How is the NCAA accounting for both of those principles, fairness and preserving competitiveness?
Well, thank you again, Senator. The fairness is extraordinarily important to us. The opportunity for student athletes is extraordinarily important. You mentioned a very important point. We at The Ohio State University have about 1,100 NCAA athletes. So when we think about the marketable name, image, and likeness of individuals, would it be a handful? I mean, it's a few of them would be in that category. And we think very much about what happens to the other 1,000+ athletes that we have. My wife and I have them over for teams over for dinner, and have been doing this for 15 years. And we get to meet our student athletes and talk to them about their experiences. And it's a wonderful chance actually to hear what they're experiencing and going through. And I will say that I was a medical school professor for years. I was a dean of admission at my medical school, and I used to look at the student athlete grades as they came in, and I would say, gosh, if it's a basketball player, I'm going to give them a little bit of credit for the winter because they're playing games and traveling and all, and that was me trying to be smart as the son of a college athlete. What I noticed is, as often as not, they would actually have better grades and test scores during the time that they were in season, because the discipline of working, or I surmise the discipline of working through what they were doing helped a lot. So we think that these are great opportunities for the student athletes, and want to make sure that we maintain that fairness. And so the three divisions are working on rules to be able to implement in a way that allows the competitive advantages to stay as fair as possible while providing opportunities for student athletes across the board.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Cruz. Senator Rosen joins us remotely.
Well, good morning, everyone. I hope you can hear me okay.
You're great.
Thank you. So thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Cantwell, to all of the witnesses for appearing here today. Higher education has gone through a major upheaval since the start of the coronavirus pandemic. School closures, of course, forced universities and colleges to move classes online, to cancel all of our wonderful sporting events. I think each one of us could, I will tell Senator Cruz, we all have some good team memories. So we'll have to all talk about that when we can get together at lunch. But we love our college sports for sure. But as college athletes begin to return to campuses for voluntary training, COVID-19 is on everyone's mind. So in the past few weeks, a number of Division I schools have reported college athletes testing positive for the coronavirus. Although the NCAA has published guidelines, just guidelines for restarting college sports, it has left it up to individual schools to decide on how to implement health and safety policies. So the lack of a unified response from the NCAA may result in what we see playing out in the states, a patchwork of mandatory and voluntary guidelines, potentially resulting in spikes in transmission of the virus in some states, in some schools, and not in others. And some colleges test their students every week, others only when you have symptoms. And so we need a strategy generally for the coronavirus, where we need a 50-state strategy, one for our whole country, not a 51-state strategy. We have to have a nationwide approach. So for Division I athletics, it seems advisable to have a one school strategy for all those 353 schools when we combat the virus. So Dr. Drake, does the NCAA plan to issue universal coronavirus guidelines to all participating colleges and universities?
I'll say this is under, thank you, Senator. This is under discussion actively on a daily basis, and we will be talking about this later on in this week. I certainly support that.
But, you know, you've used your oversight powers in the past, most notably in addressing sexual assault. So I believe that in extreme cases, such as matters of a global pandemic, it shouldn't, that the NC2A should step in to provide a nationwide framework. Not all schools have the resources to develop this, and we want to protect the safety, health and safety of all our student athletes. They are our children. And we need to be sure that if there's any long-lasting effects of this virus, we don't want to expose them to a lifelong chronic health disease. And so do you know so far if this lack of a uniform guideline, if they're impacting people's decisions to come back to school?
No, I couldn't answer that, Senator. I mean, I'll say that the policies, because it's a 50-state organization with 1,100 schools, the health policies tend to be guided locally over the years. I mean, that's been the tendency. This is a new, obviously, and evolving circumstance, and we have guidelines that we've used at our institution, which I support and would recommend for everyone. And as I said, the NC2A, my colleagues there, and I have been discussing this on an ongoing basis as the pandemic has rolled forward.
Well, I hope that you address that, because I think that having a level playing field, we're talking about sports here, would be great. Then all universities, colleges, whoever is part of under your umbrella, they're operating off the same set of rules. It makes a lot of sense. We're going to just build off what people have spoke about before, and just the remaining time that I have. We know that given the time commitment that the athletes spend in practice, training, traveling for their respective sport, and the comparatively small amount of time they spend in the classroom, is there a case to be made that some of these athletes are really no longer amateurs? And should we be reconsidering how we define student athlete? And how do we ensure that, given these demands, college and universities are giving student athletes the realistic time they need to have a quality education that's going to serve them the rest of their life? And Dr. Drake, you can go ahead and answer again, please.
Oh, thank you very much. We believe very much in the student part of student athlete, as Commissioner Sankey and others have said. Our student athletes graduate at an even higher rate than our general student body, and for them to maintain their eligibility, they have to maintain progress through school, and we support that and think about that all the time. It's been an avenue toward getting to school for so many students. We appreciate that. An avenue toward staying in school for so many, but also an avenue toward graduating from school from so many, and that's an important part of our work.
Well, I appreciate all of your work, and we want to set all of our students up for success after they graduate, and that's the purpose of this hearing today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Rosen. Senator Moran.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Thank you to you and the ranking member for conducting this hearing. Thank you for the opportunity you gave Senator Blumenthal and I to have a hearing February the 11th related to this topic of NIL. And now in this hearing, perhaps more broadly, just the care and well-being of student athletes. Let me start. I've got so many questions and so little time. Mr. Sankey or Mr. Carter, I want to talk about the A5 conferences, the requirement for providing health care. It's my understanding that among the reforms that came about, I think in 2015, there's a requirement that A5 schools must provide medical care to former student athletes for at least 2 years after graduation. Under this requirement, what kind of care, what kind of costs are covered? And what's the magic number about 2 years? Is there any suggestion or belief that it should last longer than that?
I don't know the exact expenditure, so I'll allow Keith to share a perspective from a campus. You're correct that we did, at the Autonomy 5 level, adopt that legislation. Debate about 2 years, as I recall, generated from discussion at a state level, and the Pac-12 conference introduced the original concept, which we all supported. And in fact, even without legislation, we have provided medical care at a campus level for student athletes post-eligibility. That's more a habit than a requirement that's taken place over the years prior to that legislation, which, as you noted, does now exist.
Yes, and I'll just...
Does that cover all student athletes?
The new rule did, that's right.
Okay.
Yes,
Anything further on that?
I'll just piggyback on that just briefly. Obviously for us, we're here to talk about student athletes, and I think for this particular issue, it's the right thing to do. And I think for us, we're going to make sure that our student athletes are healthy. We want to make sure that we talk to them in the recruiting process about how this is a family, and we want to take care of you and the things that you need to get done. We want to make sure that we come forward with that at the end as well. So I think it's a great policy. I don't, with Commissioner Sankey, I'm not exactly sure on why the 2 years was a part of the policy, but certainly we want to take care of our student athletes.
Let me turn to transferring to other schools. My understanding is that in most circumstances, after transferring to a different institution, the student athlete must sit out for a year before coming eligible to play again. Is there a belief that that's the appropriate requirement? Do you think that a student athlete should be able to transfer without having to sit out for that year? If not, in what circumstances do you believe that would be appropriate? And I would welcome the comments of any of our witnesses.
We're clearly moving in that direction. So there are, I think, 5 sports. There are really 3 with which I deal on a regular basis: football, men's and women's basketball, that have that 1-year residence requirement. The others will have the ability to have an exception to that rule. By January, the NCAA nationally has said that it will entertain or review legislation to alter that one year transfer withholding. We have just removed a set of restrictions on communication to free up communication, destination, and financial aid once you transfer. I think that was a good first step. This next consideration needs to consider issues like academics. I think that's an important part of the transfer world. I also believe the team to which an individual is transferring, and those student athletes have to be considered, and how you prepare a team and collect a team. But I've certainly indicated openness to the change that you've identified, which is the removal of that residence requirement. But I think there are some considerations that need to be introduced rapidly so that we can solve this problem sooner rather than later.
I have several other questions, but I welcome anybody else who has a quick comment on this one.
Who wants to volunteer?
Don't encourage them, Mr. Chairman. I want to ask about scholarships. What's the most common reason that a student athlete's scholarship is revoked? And are there circumstances in which, if you told us why an athlete's scholarship was revoked, that we would find that objectionable? Are they always revoked for what would seem to the average American, to us on this committee, which may not be the same thing as average Americans? Let me go back to average Americans. Would they find it objectionable for the way that student athletes are treated in regard to maintaining their scholarships and the circumstances in which they might be revoked?
Yeah, I would say that probably a couple of reasons. One would be an academic reason. One would be that if they were not fulfilling their academic requirements, that's obviously a reason. And then certainly if there was a disciplinary reason that reached a level that we deemed that the student athlete did not need to be at our university. Those are probably the main 2 reasons, but obviously, most of the time student athletes are there, they have that scholarship, and they're gonna be able to have that throughout their career.
Senator, I think that most Americans would be surprised at the circumstances under which student athletes keep their scholarship, that it's not something that play on the field has removed from them, and that we bring them and support them through their educations routinely.
Thank you for that answer. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And thank you, Chairman Moran. And Senator Blackburn, are you with us?
I'm with you.
You are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I thank you for the hearing today on this, but I will tell you, for our guests that are there, and we thank you for the time that you're giving us, it ought not to take another congressional hearing to have the NCAA address NIL issues. And as Chairman Moran mentioned, this is the second time we have had a hearing on this, and we had Dr. Emmert in front of us earlier this year for what proved to be a very unsatisfactory hearing and approach. So I want to do some yes and no questions. And Mr. Carter, we're going to start with you. Full disclosure, my son ran cross country there at Ole Miss. My daughter is also an Ole Miss grad. But let me work through a series of questions, and just starting with you, going to all the way through the list to Mr. Winston. Simple yes or no. Do you believe student athletes should be able to profit from their NIL? Yes or no?
Yes.
Okay, Mr. Drake?
I'm sorry, yes, I got it.
Yes.
I'm working on moving to a yes.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Thank you. And second question, has the NCAA adequately handled this situation? Again, Mr. Carter, start with you. Yes or no?
Not yet. No.
Okay.
Not completed, so, we're in process.
No.
It's a work in progress.
No.
Okay. And the third question, will a patchwork of states' laws be problematic?
Yes.
Yes.
Not as much as they say.
It will, yes.
I agree with Ms. Kohler. It's overstated the issues that will happen from a patchwork.
Okay. Well, what we know is that the NCAA has not adequately addressed this. They have that a patchwork would present some problems, and that student athletes should be able to be compensated for their name, image, and likeness. Let's see, Mr. Carter and Mr. Sankey, let me come to you. And Ms. Kohler touched on this with putting things in legislation, being a little bit prescriptive. And I think we've all looked at the report that came from the NCAA, and that was not satisfactory to say, here are some guidelines. We may or may not take a vote. That is not addressing the issue. And I think you all have to agree, this is an issue that has gotten away from you. So Mr. Carter, and then to Mr. Sankey, how can Congress help ensure accountability and transparency in this legislation, in NIL legislation, expecting that the NCAA is not going to on their own come up with something? So how do we ensure accountability? How do we ensure transparency in this?
Well, I think obviously that's why we're here today, to talk about a lot of these potential solutions. And I think that we've outlined a framework that makes a lot of sense. There are certainly some things that we need to be cautious of, and we talked about those. But I do think that putting our foot on base at some point, obviously we have a time frame. We got about 12 months before this goes into effect in Florida. So, I think that doing that, and then certainly, coming back to where does the final enforcement and monitoring lie? And I think that ends up with a hybrid approach where the NCAA is involved, Congress is involved, and then ultimately probably a third party is involved to help administer this when it's all said and done.
Do you think that there should be a morality clause included in legislation so that there would be a way to deal with bad actors?
Absolutely, yeah. I think we're going to have to anticipate those type of things. I think that certainly with the recruiting issues, the potential issues that we've talked about with agents and different people that are going to be involved in the process, I think there's got to be some guardrails there to protect against that.
Okay. Mr. Sankey?
I think Keith identified the need for a third party. I would absolutely be open to that approach. As currently structured, I'm not convinced the NCAA enforcement model is designed to handle this issue in real time. Where that authority rests, I think, remains for conversation, and I think it is an important conversation.
So you see a third party as opposed to a committee from the NCAA handling this?
Senator, I'm open to that. I've not seen other models that solve the problem beyond that part of the conversation.
Thank you. Yield back.
Thank you, Senator Blackburn. Senator Blumenthal.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. We come here in the context of a history of athletes, unfortunately, being used as profit centers. They are a source of revenue to the colleges. Very often, they are unable to benefit from their name, image, and likeness. By now, I think we've thoroughly established it in this committee through our subcommittee hearing back in February and now in this one, but there's just abundant evidence of the profiting by schools at the expense of athletes. It may be for causes that are regarded as worthwhile, like financing other sports or the cause of athleticism and the university in general. But I think the question for us is, how do we protect the athletes? How do we make sure that they are not, maybe inadvertently, victims of a process that puts them behind profits? And I think the latest example, frankly, are these waivers. Senator Booker and I have introduced legislation that essentially would prohibit them. And President Drake, you and I spoke yesterday about the Buckeye Pledge. I've since reviewed it. I know in good faith, you told me it was a pledge, but it says very explicitly that, quote, I understand that although the university is following the coronavirus guidelines issued by the CDC and other experts to reduce the spread of infection, I can never be completely shielded from all risk of illness caused by COVID-19 or other infections. And then it goes on to say that the signer, and the athlete signs this document, acknowledges that, quote, these expectations and pledge are a condition of my participation, etc. The other pledges are even more explicit. University of Tennessee, which we have, for example, University of Missouri, I understand we're trying to get SMU, but all of them, as the University of Missouri says, quote, I pledge to accept the responsibility to abide by these guidelines in order to keep myself, my teammates, etc., safe. They use the word risk and they provide for an assumption of risk by the athlete. That is, in effect, a waiver from my standpoint as a lawyer. And I guess my question to the panel is, isn't it unethical to ask a college athlete to assume the risk of participating, which has the effect of waiving rights in court if that athlete becomes sick and if his or her future is imperiled, not to mention their health, if they are affected by coronavirus? Isn't that unethical? And shouldn't it be illegal? Don't you think that the measure that Senator Booker and I have introduced should be passed forbidding these kinds of waivers? We can begin with you or any of you.
Well, let me speak maybe first, and Senator Blumenthal, I appreciate your question and our conversation. And I'll say that I don't support a waiver or an assumption of risk in a legal sense. What we want to do is to make sure that people are behaving in a responsible fashion to protect themselves and their community. And
so on behalf of Ohio State University, if any athlete ever sued your institution, you would say no rights have been foregone or waived or sacrificed.
I certainly would say that.
As a result of this document.
Yeah, just, I mean, period. I would say that we would not want anyone to assign any of
I
their.
hope your lawyers agree with you.
Well, I hope so too. But our goal really was to make sure that the students took their individual behavior as an important thing that they were going to follow, to make sure they were doing what they could to protect themselves.
Thank you, Senator Blumenthal. Senator Capito.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank all of you for being here today. Mr. Sankey, when that question was asked, should athletes be able to be compensated for their name, image, and likeness, and you said you're leaning towards, you're trying to get to yes. I'm with you. I'm trying to get to yes here, but I'm also realist to realize this train's left the station, and we got to do it right. So briefly, I have several concerns. One is on the Title IX issue, and many of you mentioned this in your statements. But I am concerned for the women athletes. My daughter was a Division I athlete. I was actually one back in the day myself, and we've come a long way, obviously, since the 70s. But I am concerned of what I could see as developing inequities in the ability to earn from your name, image, and likeness for a female athlete as opposed to the more higher profile sports that the male athletes are playing. Mr. Sankey, I'll ask everybody a question on that.
It's a bit of a hypothesis, and my assumption is football being what football is, there will be a great deal of this activity driven there. We've had women's basketball teams win national championships to play at the same time in a national championship contest with highly prominent young women involved. Our gymnastics on our network every Friday night has drawn attention. But I am concerned that the amount of NIL activity around football and men's basketball will pull away funding from women's sports.
Ms. Kohler.
Senator, I think this is an area where there's just a gender equity opportunity. So Title IX, of course, does not apply at all to name, image, and likeness deals that are provided by third parties. So if colleges get involved, which I don't think anybody on this panel supports, then we'd have a Title IX problem, a direct Title IX problem. But the types of deals talked about now present no Title IX issue. In terms of promoting gender equity generally, the main time when women athletes can profit from their name, image, and likeness is in college sports. They very often don't have professional opportunities, and I think the SEC is a great example. I mean, these women can really monetize what they have, and I think it would promote gender equity, not hinder it.
Dr.
Drake. Thank you, Senator. Yeah, we, in our principles that we've brought forward, preserving the gains we've made and continuing to move forward in this area is important in anything that is developed in name, image, and likeness monetization.
I think, Mr. Sankey, though, there's going to be, well, we'll see. I hope not, but
yeah,
I have no faith it's going to be a 50-50 deal here.
Yeah, just quickly, I think that there are going to be, if we can get to the framework that we all hope to get to, there will be hopefully an equal opportunity for both men and women. I think that there were some models that came out maybe last month that showed some of the high-profile athletes and what their value, their market value might be, and there were some women's gymnasts on the West Coast.
Based on their social media, right?
Correct, correct. And so where I think individually, women could certainly do very well, but I do kind of echo what the commissioner said, that I do think that it could potentially take away from the overall aspect of women's sports.
Okay, Mr. Winston, did you have a comment?
Yes, thank you, Senator. One thing I think to remember too is NIL is incremental. We're not taking from a current pie. We're trying to add to it, especially for the players and allowing the players and athletes to use their likeness to benefit more. So I want to make sure that that's out there. And then number two, I agree with Ms. Kohler. I think that, when you look at female athletes, they might be at the height of their market ability and to produce profit for themselves or benefit from themselves, whether it's in social media or appearances, especially when you think about certain sports that don't have professional ranks yet.
I appreciate that, and I thank you for that perspective. I do think that if the male athlete has the pro leagues ahead of him, it's in his best interest to even really ramp himself up in college in terms of his worth through social media and other things, performance, to be able to, hey, this guy, he's really going to bring it in. He's going to sell the tickets and all that kind of stuff. So I have some skepticism around this particular question. My other issue is the agents. I mean, we read every day about some college athlete who has parents have been moved to the city, shoe deals, shirt deals. The NCAA is not really able to police that. as efficiently and as effectively, and I understand they are, they're cracking down. There have been some very high-profile cases. But, when does the agent approach the athlete? When they're in ninth grade? When does the agent approach the athlete on campus to help them? I mean, this to me is, I want to be yes, but I think this is going to be an issue on campus. Mr. Sankey, do you have?
It will.
And even earlier.
It is an important part of the conversation, and the oversight of agents is important. We have a Uniform Agent Act that its enforcement varies from state to state, depending on where that enforcement responsibility is signed and how it's funded. We have had those issues arise in my conference where people are trying to go through a back door. If there can be sunshine and transparency brought to the relationships, that's healthy, but how far back can that go? And I would simply observe the activity around Zion Williamson. I don't know the details. I simply know what I've read in the media where there are lawsuits around marketing deals after his eligibility at Duke. You had a year to plan, whether people like one and done, you had a year to plan and prepare, and it's still difficult even in that circumstance. It's not going to be easier for a 16 or 17-year-old.
No, it's not. Thank you. My time has expired.
Thank you, Senator Capito. Commissioner Sankey, this agent's law is a suggested uniform state law that is adopted or not adopted by the 50 states. Is that what you're saying?
That's the existing Uniform Agent Act. I think the focus for this conversation has been SPARTA, which is a federal law. I will confess to not being an expert, but has been identified as a potentially more effective mechanism.
Okay, well, we'll try to get up to speed on that too. Senator Sullivan is next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here. It's a really important topic. I think it's an interesting topic. It's a hard topic. I mean, I love college athletics. I think we all do. It's a great part of our universities and our American culture. But my question is going to it's just one question really for all the panelists. And it really is just expanding on what Senator Capito is asking about. The way in which we're moving forward, or it looks like we're moving forward on the NIL issues, are we thinking enough about either, whatever you want to call it, inequities or unintended consequences in different categories? Let me throw out just three, and then I'll throw the question open to all the panelists. What Senator Capito mentioned, which is kind of the male-female sports and Title IX issues. The second one is, what about smaller divisions, smaller universities, right? We have Ohio State here, obviously Big Ten, but my state, the great state of Alaska, has wonderful college athletics, but it's not always in the conferences that get the big TV deals. And then, even more fundamentally, the mission of the university system and colleges, which we have in America, and it's a great advantage of ours, right? So many great universities throughout our country relative to any other country. But it's about higher education. It's about educating Americans. And I have the privilege of sitting on the Board of Visitors for the U.S. Naval Academy. It's part of my duties on the Armed Services Committee. And, we discuss a lot this issue of education, leadership, character, and then balancing college athletics, which at the Naval Academy are serious. But in my view, you don't want to create an institution that emphasizes college athletics so much that you start to actually undermine the more important mission, which I think we would all agree on, which is education, character, leadership of the next generation of Americans. So that's a broad question. I'll throw it out to all the panelists, but I'd like you to take a crack at it. Unintended consequences on those areas that I just mentioned, and potentially inequities, not just male-female, but big school, small school.
Who'll go first?
I'll jump in. I do think there are these unintended consequences, or unimagined, I think, is maybe a better phrase, because the need to think about this, even while we have a time deadline looming because of state law becoming effective, it needs to be considered. I think the educational aspect, when young people talk about their time demands, which, by the way, they said to me, I'd love to have those time demands right now because I've been disrupted in my spring. But you add running your own business effectively, your name, image, and likeness business on top. If you're stressed now, between athletics and academics, and now you have economic activity on top of that. I'm concerned about where that time is drawn. I'm concerned it comes from academics. I think that is a proper conversation. And I shared earlier.
And the message it sends about the importance of academics.
That's right. This is your economic opportunity where we have viewed, whether you fault it or not, that we will educate you, help you grow as a leader and as a person through your educational experience. As I said before, we're not perfect in that. We do that very well. And I spent 11 years of my career in the 1AA world of football, FCS as it's known, smaller state universities in small towns. And I still represent small towns in the SEC. And those economic demands and expectations are going to vary from place to place. And if I was still commissioner of the Southeastern Conference, I think my schools would be asking me, how am I going to manage this with my student athletes? Not that they're running it, but how do they manage town and gown relationships? And all of a sudden that economic activity is now added to the relational issues in a small college community. Those are real challenges under this concept.
Senator, I'd say that I think, as I said before, I think we do a lot in the name of sports prospectively, worried about unintended consequences, and we're overly restrictive in our restraints when we do. And what I would say is every student on campus currently that is not an athlete enjoys these rights. And campuses are well positioned to work with student athletes to counsel them on time management. We in higher ed do that every day. And I know from my kids, being a social media influencer or an Instagram star is actually a career. So these student athletes can learn to balance these things, and this can be a long-term entry into productive employment for them. And finally, on the Title IX issue, again, this really has the possibility of enhancing gender equity and drawing a spotlight onto women's sports where it hasn't existed before.
I'll go next, Senator, if you don't mind.
Sure.
There's a perceived, seems like fallacy going on right now that there isn't already massive inequity in the college athletic system. Take a look at the facilities at Ohio State compared to Ohio University, at Ole Miss compared to Southern Miss. There's massive disparities already. So acting as if we're going to give college students some rights to make money, as if that's going to create some massive inequity in a system that already has a massive recruiting inequity already, is I think is a big fallacy that is being kind of perpetrated, not necessarily intentionally by the members here or by the witnesses here. I'm just saying that it seems like we're pretending that there is some sort of equity across the playing field of college athletics right now that simply does not exist. That just simply look at the facilities of some of these big time colleges compared to the smaller D1 colleges, UT to University of Houston even. There's massive differences here. And then I would also say there's a little bit of, I don't know if hypocrisy is the right word, that we're asking kids to sign waivers to deal with an epidemic, but yet they're pandemic, but they can't balance tweeting something out for $100 and still go to class. So I want to give the college athlete, while he has to balance and she has to balance a lot, more credit than that, and also point out that inequity that already exists in the system, and that this NIL would be incremental and not take away from anything that's currently happening.
Thank you. Other members of the panel may want to supplement their answers to Senator Sullivan's question. Senator Scott.
Thanks for being here. I was governor of Florida from 2011 to 2018, and one thing we did was we really focused our university system and our state college system on results. And so we actually allocated $580 million to our university system, primarily tied to three things. What's it cost to get a degree? So we knew our students were going to get degrees. Number two, did you get a job, and how much money do you make? Now, my understanding is the NCAA keeps track of graduation rates, but not, if people are employed afterwards or how much money do they make. So the way I look at this is anything we're going to do, it ought to be tied to somebody having success, and that means being employed after, having a job after school, and making as much money as they're interested in making. So what do you think about that? And do you think that makes any sense? If we're going to do anything, shouldn't it be tied to job creation and compensation after graduation?
The NCAA just released a Gallup survey that tracked, I think, satisfaction. I think some of that was job success for student athletes, which was by comparatives higher than the general student population. I'm not an expert on that report, but it was released last week. For the Southeastern Conference, when I began as commissioner, one of our issues was how do we help young people transition in their careers, and our universities have led in that. Vanderbilt University, through an internship program during the summer, rather than just being in summer school to prepare people for that transition. We have a career tour that unfortunately was disrupted in the spring, where we would have been in Dallas, Texas with a group of football student athletes, introducing them to corporate leaders there. And we've had success in exploring what is really a new activity for a conference office for that purpose, Senator.
I'd say that when at Ohio State, I'm president of Ohio State for 6 years. I was the chancellor at the University of California, Irvine for 9 years, so a different level of competitive focus there. And I'd say at Ohio State, when we arrived, we actually changed the athletic director's contract so that he was compensated for the job placement or going to graduate school or serving in the military for our student athletes when they finish, rather than for success in Olympic sports, because we think that's critically important.
That's great. I didn't know that.
And I'll just add, too, I think I'm short-term AD at Ole Miss. I'm in the first year, but doing recruiting presentations to parents and potential student athletes, we always talk about, we want you to come in and be a part of our family. We're going to put you in a position to succeed, and that means not only getting a degree, but getting a meaningful degree, something that you can go out after you finish your playing days and be successful. And as I mentioned to the group earlier, with our class last year that graduated, we placed 100% of those into jobs. Some were professional athletes, others going into just the normal working world. But that's what it's all about. And so if there's any way we can tie back any of this potential legislation to that education piece, I'm all for it.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Senator Scott. The term booster is a term of art under the NCAA. Dr. Drake, in short, what is a booster?
I think that's someone who supports the athletic program, and the term of art is used because sometimes that support can be overly aggressive.
Would you support legislation as we move to NIL to prohibit boosters from paying student athletes for NIL?
Well, again, it's a term of art and broadly described, but I would say that any compensation for NIL should be market-based and appropriate. And if I could use the term boosterism to make the term a little larger, when one got beyond normal market-based support, then that would be the thing that I'd be concerned about.
Well, I think you, Dr. Drake, you said you think it will end up that a handful of student athletes will benefit from NIL if this goes forward, and it appears it's going forward. Could you put a percentage on that?
Yeah, and I'll say this: there are we've heard about group licenses, which would be a different thing, which would potentially benefit more. I was thinking more of individual licenses and the number of those athletes that we have that have a marketable image, and then those who might make it on social media as influencers.
Say you have 22 starters on a football team.
Well, how many would you be able to name? You know, if I asked you, I'm not, forgive me, Senator, not to reverse the questions, but in our own university,
offensive tackles.
Yeah,
we like them.
We think that the real potential might be for, again, a handful, 3-4 students might be the ones who'd be able to do commercials or those kinds of things.
Mr. Carter, what about this? What do you think? Will it be just a handful?
Yes, I think overall it's probably a handful that end up with these larger sponsorship deals, but I think it's certainly nuanced, because you could have the offensive guard that you referenced that maybe it isn't as well known, but back in their hometown they are well known. And so they could go back to their hometown and do something that maybe they couldn't currently do now. So I think it could extend a little farther than maybe just the nationally recognized players, because I think there's an opportunity for some other people back with their own constituencies.
Well, isn't it easy to envision a hometown guy or gal having some sort of little sweet deal in every little hometown, and it approaches pay for play pretty quick?
Yes, absolutely. And I think that's where the proper structure and the proper framework has got to be in place, where we do have kind of that hybrid approach where NCAA is working with, working with Congress, working with this third party, and certainly with our athletics departments to talk about compliance and making sure that we're following the right protocols and procedures.
If any of you want to follow on, I'll ask Ms. Kohler first. Give us, for instances, and I was particularly interested in your point that collegiate women players had significant opportunities to monetize their fame and popularity. Would you give us some examples of that so that we can understand it?
Yeah, I think the car dealership hometown hero model is an outdated model in the sense that that's always going to happen. But if you look at women athletes, if you look at Caitlin Ohashi from UCLA, the 10-0 floor routine that went viral for gymnastics fans last year, she could have really monetized that. She could have been an Instagram influencer, social media star, started a YouTube channel. These are things that my kids could explain to you probably better than I can. But I think this is where women athletes can really use digital platforms to launch brands, to create brands, nutrition podcasts. I mean, there are any number of things. If you look at NCAA waivers on this issue that is in the Board of Governors report, you can see women athletes trying to seek waivers so that they can do these types of things. So maybe women athletes aren't going to be necessarily endorsing the car dealerships, but they are going to have a viral floor routine. They are going to have a great softball game. They're going to have something where they can take their personality, elevate their sport, and elevate themselves.
Do you agree with Dr. Drake that this will affect only a handful, or do you think, as on the surface, I imagine that this is going to be almost everybody by the time it's over with?
Yeah, I think when we have discussions about this, we tend to focus on the superstars in the revenue-generating sports. And I think what's exciting about name, image, likeness and legislation is that this opens up new frontiers. Students from small schools, from underappreciated sports, again, women's sports, people can become stars on the internet that maybe aren't stars that you and I always see. And so I think actually there are many, many more athletes that could capitalize on these rights.
50%, 70%?
It's hard to put a number on it, but what I would say is if the restrictions were lifted, what's happening is that the free market goes to work. And so 50% or more, I think students will try. I think they will try and launch their podcast. I think they will try and become Instagram influencers. I think they will try and take advantage of these rights that in some cases can lead to long-term careers, because I think that the lift is so easy when we're talking about digital platforms. So I do think it's far greater than a handful, but whether it's half or 75%, I don't know. I think a lot of people will try. How many succeed, the market will sort out.
Who was this example you mentioned, I think, at Ohio State?
Oh, I mentioned Caitlin Ohashi, the gymnast from UCLA.
From UCLA, okay.
Yes.
And without embarrassing her, what do you think she could have received had she been able to monetize her success in social media?
I'm going to defer to Mr. Winston to talk about actual numbers. What I will say is you can look at the millions of views she got for that one floor routine that was put out on Twitter. And so you can be paid $400, $200. You can be paid for social media posts. It's a great way to make a living. So I think after that floor routine went viral, she could have had a lot of digital endorsements. She could have had a lot of sort of brick and mortar type situations. So I think Mr. Winston can probably put a number on it better than I can. But if you look at the millions of views she had, she could have turned that into real dollars.
Okay, well, we'll take an answer from Mr. Winston. We're going to take a second round, Senator Blumenthal, and so you'll be recognized next, sir. But Mr. Winston, you want to weigh in on an estimate of how she might have monetized her?
Well, I don't think anybody can be certain because the market's not hasn't been available. But if you look at influencers, professional influencers, not even just athletes, but other entertainers or people that have built followings we could be talking about several $1,000s, even into like a small 5-figure amount because of that following. And what Ms. Kohler is saying is right on. And it is nuanced, as Mr. Carter said as well. If somebody, and when I was in college, said, hey, I'll give you $100 to tweet something out and ad for a local restaurant or something like that, that would have been great too. So I also think when we talk about what kind of compensation will be available for how many people, it is a wide-ranging scale, but that Ms. Kohler is spot on that technology will be driving a lot of this for a lot of people, because obviously their audiences will be similar aged, and they will be able to create content themselves, and the list really goes on to the possibilities.
Well, if I had the money as a local businessman and I could do it, I would want to pay $100 to every member of the Ole Miss football team to tweet something out on my behalf. And I just wonder if that's where we're headed.
Possibly. I can't, it's obviously it's impossible to see the future. I'm not sure if you're referring to some sort of pay for play scheme. I don't look at it like that, but obviously if there's a local restaurant that wants to associate himself with the offensive line, perhaps, obviously, could have an appearance by the offensive line at the restaurants, pubbing up their steaks or their ribs, would probably be a good venture for them, or even simply Instagram a picture of them eating at the restaurant or being in front of the restaurant or whatever. There's so many different ways to do this actually in a very streamlined and time efficient way now that it's I don't think anybody's realized maybe all of the possibilities that are out there.
Thank you very much. Senator Blumenthal, round two.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman, and thank you again for the hearing and for the second round. I just want to pursue this line of questioning that I began because it is so immediately concerning. According to a June 26th Vice report, and I'm quoting, more than 150 players at NCAA Division I revenue sports have tested positive for coronavirus, end quote. These numbers are almost certainly lower than the actual number, because only 64 of the 130 relevant schools are publicly reporting their positive COVID-19 cases, just as we're seeing astronomical rises in certain states among the general population. We're seeing unquestionably rising numbers among college athletes reporting back to school. And so, number one, I'd like to ask Mr. Drake, will you commit to requiring all colleges to disclose the number of COVID-19 cases that occur at their schools?
Yeah, I mean, that's HIPAA and other issues are in effect, so I think that that disclosing information is useful.
So you will commit to requiring them to report those cases?
I don't know that I commit to requiring, forgive me, Senator.
Commit to require the disclosure of the number of positive COVID-19 cases.
I don't want to be difficult. Who would I commit to do? Well, I don't know what authority I'd have to
disclose publicly, to require them to report and for you to disclose publicly.
I believe it's appropriate for the schools to report, and with proper privacy protections for the individuals in place, I think that's a reasonable thing.
But general numbers, they should be reporting. Yes. And on the issue of waivers, is there anyone here who does not support the legislation that Senator Booker and I have introduced that would prohibit waivers of rights on the part of college athletes if they contract COVID-19?
I'll just tell you our experience at Ole Miss. We did not ask our student athletes to sign a waiver when they came back, and obviously all workouts are voluntary. We felt like the procedures and protocols that we put into place were very good, And what we found is that as student athletes returned, we had a few positive cases. As they spent time together, the cases spiked some, and now we're seeing it go back down. I think they're starting to realize the protocols are needed. They need to do the
So
things.
you saw some positive cases.
We did, yes, sir. And but again, I think our protocols were there. What we did, we tested for both COVID and antibodies when they arrived, and from there we basically test based on symptoms.
But you would support what we've introduced as the College Athlete Pandemic Safety Act to address this concern that the colleges are asking them to waive rights. And I understand that you have not asked for any such waiver, but you would have no problem with the legislation.
Well, I would probably have to know a little bit more about the legislation to put my foot on base, but based on our actions, we did not require the waiver and will not require the waiver.
I understand that the NCAA would like broad federal preemption over state laws concerning athlete compensation and guardrails for athlete earning streams, and in addition would like an antitrust exemption and to be the oversight body and regulator of NIL deals. In the past, the NCAA has really in many ways failed to protect the athletes. Wouldn't it be better, Mr. Drake, to have an independent body to oversee these deals rather than have the NCAA do it?
Well, I certainly would support continuing discussions about how the oversight should be done, and would certainly be open to an independent body being a part of that. Sure.
Let me ask you, Professor Kohler, what do you think about those issues, the antitrust exemption, the oversight, independence, and so forth?
Well, I strongly oppose a blanket antitrust exemption for the NCAA for the fact that what we've seen in recent antitrust cases is it's produced good for student athletes. I mean, what Mr. Carter talked about with increased food availability, stipends, cost of attendance, this is as a result of antitrust cases, and I think that's an important accountability check on the free market and on the NCAA. But second of all, I don't think they should get a blank check here because we don't know yet exactly what they're going to do. The Board of Governors report is very, very squishy, as I would say to my law students in terms of principles. They've had years to come up with pointed, guiding, concrete steps. We don't have that, and what they're asking for now in their report is a broad-based antitrust exemption, which would be extraordinary even in sports.
Well, it would be certainly extraordinary in college athletics. As you well know, NHL, Major League Baseball, and so forth have antitrust exemptions.
That's with the presence of a union, Senator. That's the non-statutory labor exemption where athletes have a voice. That's a very, very different scenario than what we have here.
That is an excellent point. And in fact, in my view, those antitrust exemptions ought to be reviewed and scrutinized because they are highly exceptional. And I think it could be argued that those leagues have failed to live up to the public interest trust that they are conditioned on. So I have more questions. I'll submit them for the record. I'd like these waivers to be submitted for the record.
And without objection, that would be done.
And I would like to ask every one of the witnesses, first of all, let me say for the record that I would like your response in writing on this legislation. I understand that only Mr. Carter expressed any objection here in asking to review it, but I understand that the others may want to review it as well. If you give me your views, I would greatly appreciate it. And I would like for the witnesses to submit to me any other waiver documents that you become aware of. This will apply, I think, particularly to Mr. Sankey and Mr. Drake.
Well, thank you, Senator Blumenthal. And clearly, questions for the record will be submitted by senators, including Senator Blumenthal, and witnesses will be asked to cooperate in and getting us a timely response. So thank you very much. Our next questioner is Senator Moran for round 2.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Thank you for the second round. Let me express my gratitude to you and your cooperation with our subcommittee and Senator Blumenthal, the ranking member of our subcommittee, for our dealings on this topic. It's a difficult one that does absolutely need our attention. I just have one question. I want to have a better understanding of the financial consequences to athletic departments, better understanding of what, and I'm talking about with a legislation dealing with NIL, what that legislation might mean to non-revenue generating sports. And I'm asking this question of all of our witnesses. My understanding is that looking at 2018 financial data that was developed by USA Today, the publication, only 12 of 230 athletic departments analyzed produced a profit on an annual basis. The remaining departments received additional support from other sources, such as their institution, student fees, or state support. Approximately 91% of athletic departments received over $1 million in support, and for nearly 80% of the departments, that support accounted for more than a quarter of their revenue. So the question is, how does NIL legislation affect the financial circumstances of an athletic department? Is it positive, negative? Why would it have a consequence to the department's revenues, either positive or negative? And what should we be worried about when it comes to the consequences of NIL legislation to non-revenue producing sports?
Shall we just go down the line there, Senator Moran?
That'd be fine, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Mr. Carter.
Very good question. I think that the answer and the hope is that it would be a neutral effect. You know, I think that if we could find the right framework, that the money, as Mr. Winston mentioned, would be new revenue. However, I do think that using our market as an example, a small market where our media rights partner Learfield may go out to a local sponsor to do a sponsorship through our partnership. Well, that sponsor may then have the decision to make. Do I spend that money through the Ole Miss athletic department in Learfield, or do I give it to a student athlete? And obviously, we want the best for our student athletes, and if that was the direction that they went, then we're all for that. But it would decrease the amount coming into our department, which could have trickle-down effects to some of our sports and some of our programming. So, and again, unintended consequences, things that we've talked about a lot, but there could be some of those that we don't foresee.
Dr. Drake.
Thank you.
I would expect it to be essentially neutral if it's third-party money coming in from outside. I've overseen 2 programs, one that's a high-resource program, and then one that was a deficit program of about $10 or $11 million a year, so I've seen it from both ways, and this should be money coming in from the outside.
Professor Kohler, college athletics is still going to be a multi-billion-dollar business for the universities and for the media, whether this goes through or not, correct?
Correct. That's correct. In response to the senator's question, what I think is to the extent that, and I think the colleagues here on the panel have said it's not clear that it would affect non-revenue sports, but to the effect we do have problematic effects, then college athletic departments need to be better stewards of their budget. Maybe look at the salaries for strength and conditioning coaches and support your volleyball team instead.
Mr. Sankey.
Finally forgot to press the button. We support our programs very well across the board. In the Southeastern Conference. But we've also had questions about the range of college and university athletic programs. It will not be simply a neutral impact across the board. Now, Mr. Carter describes the third-party rights activity that happens with local advertising sales. Is that an impact? Sure. But in the scope of millions and billions, probably not the largest impact. Yet we're here talking about the range of Division I, Division II, Division III universities and others where it will be impacted because it's not an unlimited pool of resources locally. What happens in social media is a different world, so that's almost a different conversation. But the local impact that we transition to in one of the earlier conversations will be felt, and it'll depend on the scope of that program to be able to identify the results. We're also in a really interesting economic time to make predictions about what will or won't happen.
Certainly true. Mr. Winston.
Yes, thank you, Senator. I would say neutral to additive. Obviously, when you think about how much money the programs are making now from video games, that's $0. How much they're making from trading cards, being able to license their marks to trading cards, that's $0. So that's completely additive. Obviously, if a student athlete is tweeting something or doing something that's that's additive to them. I would even submit on the sponsorship front that Mr. Carter brought up. I've heard that, and I understand the argument. I would also say, though, that when you combine the player marks with the school marks on the sponsorship front, that's even more valuable, right? It's even more valuable to both sides. You can look at professional sports on the sponsorship model. They'll tell you that if you have the athlete with the professional marks, that's worth more. So again, I would say that at the very least, it's going to be neutral, but I think I think people will be creative, and I think it will be additive for both sides.
Thank you, Senator Moran.
Thank you.
Let me ask, in terms of agents, does anyone wish to weigh in on the question of whether an agent should be able to approach a high school athlete before he signs with a college or university? Any opinions on that? Surely, Mr. Winston, surely you have an idea on that. Should we limit it?
No, I would agree with that. Yeah, you wouldn't want agents in this process, especially at the high school level. Obviously, when you're talking about a star player that would be considered in a some sort of deal, right? You would want professional representation, or at least the family, I'm guessing, would want professional representation, whether that be a lawyer or an agent. But I think we can probably all agree that any sort of, and I would even go as far, and this was a previous remark, we wouldn't want to see any inducements, obviously, to go to college from that. Now, I wouldn't want to use those words against me from derivative side either, right? I mean, obviously, the market's going to dictate certain behavior, but at the same time, I wouldn't want a college or someone saying to a player, obviously, you'll make this much money if you come here.
Anybody else want to weigh in on the issue of agents? Okay, I think we're about finished, Senator Blumenthal. Dr. Drake, I understand you have been President Emeritus now for some 12 hours and 20 minutes. Is that correct? So, and I assume based on how you looked that it was a rather modest retirement party.
COVID, yes, COVID controlled, yes.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Carter, does the date February 14th, 1998 mean anything to you?
It does.
How many three-pointers did you get against the University of Kentucky in that 73-64 victory?
Several.
Well, you'll be allowed to submit that question for the record. I want to thank the panel for a very interesting and I think important hearing and for providing us with quite a bit of expert testimony. As I alluded earlier, the hearing record will remain open for 2 weeks. During this time, senators are asked to submit any questions for the record. Upon receipt, the witnesses are requested to submit their written answers to the committee as soon as possible, but by no later than Wednesday, July 15, 2020. And with that, I conclude the hearing. I thank the witnesses, and this hearing is adjourned. The restroom is close by.
Well, yeah. Maybe before policies. Thank you very much.